Hey guys, we're back. I'm gonna be reading a little bit more out of Fuzzy Mud. If you're following along with me, we're now on chapter 13, and this book is kind of going back and forth between what's happening in the plot, and then they're going to the Senate hearing that they're talking about bioline, the fuel in the book. So this is called Disaster Warning, and this is excerpted from the secret Senate hearings. Professor Alice Mayfair says, "When I was born in 1975, there were 4 billion people living in the world. That's a lot. 100 years ago, there were less than 2 billion. But today, as I speak to this committee, there are more than 7 billion of us." Senator Foote says, "What does this have to do with bioline?" Professor Alice Mayfair says, "More than 300,000 babies are born every single day, day after day after day. Every one of them will need food and water and energy." Senator Foote, "Exactly why this country needs bioline." Senator Wright, "Excuse me, Professor. It was my understanding that you were going to testify about possible disasters that could result from the man-made organisms being introduced into the environment. It sounds to me like maybe you are in favor of bioline." Professor Alice Mayfair, "Oh, there will be disasters, whether from bioline or something else, who knows. By the year 2050, an additional 2 billion people will inhabit this planet. 9 billion. Senator Foote, "Which is why we need bioline." Professor Alice Mayfair, "Unless we do something to control world population, nothing will help us. Senator, not bioline, not super duper crops and fertilizers, not colonies on Mars." Senator Wright, "Let me get this straight. You want us to keep people from having too many babies all over the world?" Professor Alice Mayfair, "Yes." Senator March, laughing, "I'm afraid that's just a bit beyond the scope of this committee." All right, chapter 14. It's Wednesday, November 3rd at 9:40 in the morning. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, the students in Miss Filbert's class had to write in their journals. Sometimes she let them write about whatever they wanted, but more often she gave them a prompt. Tamaya preferred the prompts. It was strange, but she found it harder to think of something to write when she could write about anything in the world. Most everyone else always moaned and groaned when they heard the prompts. It didn't seem to matter what the prompts were. Some people just liked to complain. Today, Miss Filbert wrote the prompt on the whiteboard and then said it aloud. How to blow up a balloon. Along with the usual moans and groans, there were also a lot of huhs and whats. Hands were raised all around Tamaya. "I don't get it," Jason spoke out without raising his hand. "You just stick it into your mouth and blow." "Oh, you mean like this?" asked Miss Filbert. Tamaya watched wide-eyed as her teacher took a red balloon and placed the whole thing inside of her mouth. Miss Filbert took a big breath and then blew, spitting the balloon out onto the floor. Everyone laughed, including Tamaya. She smiled at Hope, who sat next to her, and then tried to catch Monica's eye on the other side of the room. Monica was looking back at her, sharing her amazement. Miss Filbert scratched her head as if she were greatly confused. That didn't work," she said. "No, you don't just put the whole balloon in your mouth," said Jason, again, without raising his hand. "Just one end." Miss Filbert slapped herself on the forehead. Well, why didn't you say that in the first place?" She chose another balloon and this time put only one end into her mouth. The wrong end. "No, the other end," called Monica. Miss Filbert turned the balloon around. "Now blow," said Monica. Once again, Miss Filbert spit the balloon out onto the floor. All around Tamaya, kids were shouting instructions, trying to tell Miss Filbert what she had done wrong. Others were repeating to their friends what they had just seen, even though their friends had just seen it too. Miss Filbert held up 2 fingers and waited for everyone to quiet down. "Don't tell me," she said. "Write it. Pretend that what you write is going to be read by someone who never, ever saw a balloon before in her whole life, and she's none too bright, neither." Miss Filbert knocked on the side of her head as if testing to see if it were hollow. Tamaya laughed. Her mind was already working on her how to blow up a balloon instructions. So your instructions have to be clear and precise, Miss Filbert continued. Later, you can read them aloud, and we will see how many balloons I managed to inflate. The complainers were moaning and groaning again, but Tamaya was up for the challenge. She picked up her pencil and she thought for a moment, and then she wrote, "You start with a flat balloon. You want to fill it with air from your lungs." The rest of the class was still buzzing about their teacher spitting balloons. From across the aisle, Hope tapped Tamaya on the shoulder. "Hey, what happened to your sweater?" she whispered. Tamaya's heart sank. She had hoped it wasn't too noticeable. "What do you mean?" she whispered back. "It's all torn." Tamaya shrugged. "Who cares?" she said, trying to prove that she wasn't the goody two-shoes that Hope thought she was. She returned to her journal. She reread what she had written, and then she added, "Look for the end with the hole." No, she didn't like that. A hole was the last thing you wanted in a balloon. For all she knew, Miss Filbert might stick a pin into the balloon just to put a hole there. She tried to think of what else to call it. The knobby round thing? She tried to erase what she had written, but instead she made an ugly gray smudge on her paper. Tamaya's pages were always clean and neat, and she had excellent handwriting. She tried rubbing harder, but not hard enough to tear the page. A red drop fell on top of the smudge. At first, Tamaya was more worried about her journal being ruined than anything else, but when she looked at her hand, she was horrified to see that it was covered with blisters and blood. She dropped her pencil. It rolled across her journal, leaving a red track behind it, and then continued across her desk and fell to the floor. "Miss Filbert," called Hope, "Tamaya's all bloody." More math. 2 times 256, if you can see that, is 512. And 2 times 512 is 1024. We're still thinking about exponential growth with the bioline. We're going to read chapter 15 and then stop there. This is called Down in the Dungeon. Remember where Marshall has class, the 7th grade? They call it the dungeon. There was still no sign of Chad when Marshall walked into his classroom and took his seat. His relief quickly turned into anxiety, however. He turned his head towards the door. Every single time he heard it open, he knew that Chad would be coming waltzing in at any moment, telling everyone about what had happened in the woods and about how Marshall had needed a little 5th grade girl to protect him. Even after class had started and Chad still hadn't shown, Marshall's anxiety only grew worse. He tapped his foot throughout the morning announcements. In a way, he hoped that Chad would just hurry up and get there. Let him do whatever he was going to do, say what he was going to say, and just get it over with. The worst part was the waiting. When the first period ended, Marshall moved very cautiously through the hall, certain that Chad was waiting behind every corner. He made it safely to algebra, and when he saw that Chad's desk was empty, he finally was able to relax, but just a little bit. Math had always been Marshall's best subject. Without Chad's eyes burning a hole through the back of his head, he was able to concentrate for the first time in weeks. Mr. Brandt put a pair of simulations equations on the whiteboard. Marshall mentally went through the necessary steps to solve them, just as his teacher worked through them for the class. Mr. Brandt put up 2 more equations. Anyone want to try? Chad or no Chad, Marshall still didn't dare to raise his hand. Perhaps Mr. Brandt had caught something in Marshall's expression, an alertness in his eyes. "Marshall," he said, "you want to give it a go?" Marshall flinched at the mention of his name, and then he slowly rose. As he made his way to the front of the room, he heard none of the usual snide whispers. No legs stuck out trying to trip him. He took the marker from Mr. Brandt, he studied the 2 equations for a moment, and then he wrote a new equation. Combining the elements from the other 2, he felt his confidence grow as he replaced the letters with numbers. Behind him, the door opened. It couldn't even have been called a squeak, just an old door rotating on its hinges, but Marshall recognized the sound the moment he heard it. His confidence left him as his legs turned to jelly. He tried to concentrate on the equations in front of him, but now it was all just a confused jumble of numbers and letters and mathematical signs. He heard the click-click of hard shoes on the floor. That didn't sound like Chad. He slowly turned. The headmistress, Mrs. Thaxton, was walking purposefully towards the front of the room, a stern and determined look on her face. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Brant," she said, and then she turned her back on Marshall in order to face the class. "I'm afraid that I have some very disturbing news." Marshall didn't know where he was supposed to go. He didn't want to have to cross in front of Mrs. Thaxton in order to return to his desk. Instead, he slowly edged away from the board towards the side wall. She spoke slowly and deliberately. "One of your classmates, Chad Hilligus, is missing. He hasn't been seen ever since he left school yesterday afternoon. As far as we know, he never made it home." Mrs. Thaxton took a breath and then continued, "If any of you know anything about where he might have gone or what has happened to him, I need to know immediately." Nobody said a word. As Marshall stood at the side wall, his thoughts were a swirling mass of confusion. He had become paralyzed at the mention of Chad's name. He could hear the pounding of his heart echoing inside of his head. "Does anybody remember seeing Chad after school yesterday?" asked Mr. Brant. "If you saw or heard anything," coaxed Mrs. Thaxton. Marshall knew that he ought to say something, but it seemed impossible. Laura Muskrantz slowly raised her hand. "Yes, Laura," said Mr. Brant. "I saw him." "Where?" "On Richmond Road." "Did he say anything to you?" Mrs. Thaxton asked her. "No, I was in my mom's car. We just drove past. You asked if we saw him at all, that's all." Marshall wondered if Laura would have noticed him too if he had been there. "Did you notice which way he was heading?" asked Miss Thaxton. "If you leave the school and turn right, I think. We drove the other way, so I didn't see him after that." "Did anyone else see or talk to Chad?" asked Mrs. Thaxton. "Either after school or perhaps earlier. Did he say what his plans were after school?" Cody raised his hand and then quickly lowered it, but not before Mr. Brant noticed. "Do you know something, Cody?" "Well, he kind of told me what he was going to do, but I feel kind of weird saying it." "What did he tell you, Cody?" demanded Mrs. Thaxton. "This is not the time to worry about being embarrassed or feeling weird." "Okay, you asked," Cody shrugged. "He said he was going to beat up Marshall." Muffled laughter came back from the corner of the room, but one look from Mrs. Thaxton silenced whoever had laughed. "Sorry, man," Cody said, looking at Marshall. "That's what he said." For the first time, Mrs. Thaxton turned to notice Marshall standing awkwardly against the wall. "Marshall, what do you know about this?" All he could manage was a shrug. It took all of his effort just to keep from trembling. "Did you encounter Chad on your way home yesterday?" He shook his head. "Did you know he was looking for you?" "No," he said. "You didn't see him at all?" "I just walked home like always. He wasn't there." Mrs. Thaxton took a long, hard look at him. "Do you know why he wanted to fight you? Did something happen earlier?" He shook his head. "Chad's been picking on Marshall all year," said Andy, "for no reason." "Marshall never did anything," volunteered Laura. "Chad's just mean." Mrs. Thaxton took another long look at Marshall, and then she turned her attention back to the rest of the class. "If anybody thinks of anything else, any little thing that Chad might have done or said, or something that somebody else might have said about Chad, please let Mr. Brant or me know. If you need to talk in private, I will be in my office. Please think hard and don't be afraid to come to me. I will keep anything that you tell me strictly confidential." And then she walked out of the room, and then all eyes fixed on Marshall. He quickly returned to his seat. The equations remained on the whiteboard, unsolved. All right, we'll pick up with chapter 16 tomorrow.